Welcome to topic 5, and this is bringing it all together. And so we've reached the end of this journey. Next week we'll be looking at a Q&A session before you go into your final test in your seminars, and this week is an opportunity for you to reflect back on all of the material that you've covered, including the opportunity that you had to visit an organisation and to interview a social worker, with particular reference to how did you analyse, what's your analysis of that organisation, and you'll find out why that's so important as I walk you through some of the key concepts. So what I plan to do today is not to read slavishly from the set of slides that are available to you, because there are many slides. The reason for that is that we've developed quite a comprehensive pack for revision for the subject, but to really pull out some of the key concepts and to try to flag where you might best really focus your attention and your energy as you read for revision. So this is really a guide to the topics for revision, and I guess to say before I begin too, as well as looking back through the slides, it will be great for you to be focusing your revision on the particular chapters in Hughes and Waring and McDonald and Craik that you focused on in your seminars. And because they were mandatory texts, yes, you're going to say, yes, it's almost all of the books, and you're quite right about that. Let's start at the beginning. We began with some definitions, didn't we? And we looked at what a human service organisation was, and you'll see definitions in any of the texts, both the mandatory and the recommended texts. And my hot tip for you is that there's probably going to be a question in the quick quiz that invites you to define a human service organisation. I think it will be also important for you to think about why are we interested in definitions of human service organisations, and why is it useful in any event. And I hope by the time you get to this point that you've got some good ideas about this. Why is it useful to think about the relevance of social work and organisations? Social work usually isn't an individual activity. In those very rare occasions, and yes, I've had a small bit of my career in this space where we might be a lone ranger in private practice, we could argue that we're operating as an individual, not as an individual within an organisation. In fact, that's a fallacy anyway, because as an individual private practitioner, you are probably in touch with a range of organisations and need organisational savvy in order to effectively navigate your way around tensions and constraints, opportunities, and also just to have a sense of being strategic. Organisational awareness can be invaluable even as an individual. But for the bulk of the time, we as social workers are working inside organisations. So to have a real sense of how social work can operate within hierarchical or flatter structures, what structures mean, what funding sources mean, what policy effectively means, and what program direction, how you can influence and strategically impact on, even as a new graduate, even as someone who might not be in a leadership role but can take leadership, how you can impact upon policy within the organisation, I think is something that you've had an opportunity to think about and to look at over this period of time. So there are a whole bunch of reasons that social work in organisations is a good idea to think about, alongside the definition of human services organisations. There's so much to say about theoretical perspectives, isn't there? And we spent in lecture 3 a whole lecture, and you'll go back and look at the slides, I'm sure, and you'll see that Fiona Gardner has a chapter dedicated. It's not in the mandatory text, but it is posted up on Moodle for you. A whole chapter in relation to theorising organisations. What will I say about that rather than go through the slides slavishly? If we're on about not just describing what is, but understanding and analysing why it is, then use of a theoretical lens can be enormously helpful. And so we draw upon organisational theory, but we also draw upon a couple of other things in this subject. One is practice theory, range of practice theories that you'll be more or less familiar with, because as practitioners we can, I think, quite readily apply our practice theories to an analysis of organisations. And Fiona Gardner does that well in her chapter, so have a look at that. But Hughes and Waring do something a bit different, and that is one of your core texts. They look at what could be quite simplistically termed the use of metaphor, but in fact it's quite a complex chapter, but one that's helpful, that we look at organisations through the lens of metaphor, and I like that idea because it helps us to analyse not just what is, but also I believe it will help you in organisations as social workers to understand the meaning behind what you're hearing. People will often talk about and use metaphor in day-to-day conversation in organisations, and it can give you, if you start to really hear the use of that language, of the metaphor, so unpacking, what does that mean? Machinery metaphor, often sports metaphors, we're kicking goals. Managers will often talk about winning and kicking goals and outcomes, and what are the implications of that kind of language for you? What do you think about the emphasis on outcomes or outputs rather than outcomes? And in terms of managerialism and the importance of efficiency, potentially over effectiveness, that we looked at later in the series, some of this language can be a bit of a tip. In the end, all we're doing is forming some ideas or some hypotheses about what we might be seeing, and having some conversations about what we think we might have as an analysis about an organisation, because I'm not suggesting that any of this gives us any certainty, but it does potentially give us a depth of understanding that we haven't had previously, or that we might not otherwise have, rather. So let's come back to the test at the end, because what we're doing is two things. We're having a quick quiz, question answer, where you will be asked very directly questions about, for example, definitions and core concepts. When I'm thinking about theories though, you will be given quite a complex case scenario, and it'll be quite detailed, and you will be asked to bring your own analysis to that. And one of the best ways that I know bringing an analysis to something is to start to use a theoretical lens. So you can have a bob each way. You can start to look at metaphor, you can look at some practice theory, you can draw upon organisational theory. There is no right or wrong theory, but it's really a matter for you as a professional. How are you bringing your theoretical lens to this case material, and how are you responding in the final test? Moving on from what I think is quite a lot of material about theory, we also talked about context, didn't we? And we talked about context, legislation, public policy and policy. Before we talked about context, go back a step, because I think that one of the first things that we did after really getting a head around what an organisation is, and what you took into your visit to the organisation and the interview with the social worker, was a sense of, well, how do organisations work? What's important? Why is an organisational chart helpful? What are the mechanics of organisations? What about reporting arrangements? What about governance? What does governance mean? What's a board of director's job versus a minister of parliament who might be the head of a government organisation? What's the difference between a government organisation and a community services organisation? What about history? How does the history of the organisation impact on the way things are done around here? And And then later in the series we talked about, when I say things are done around here, we talked about culture. What about culture? This isn't something that will be written down. The hierarchy, the maps, the way that the place is run will be written down one way or the other. And you know that because you presented that in your group presentations, lots of the nuts and the bolts of the organisations. That will be really important to review because you'll bring that to an analysis, and there'll certainly be some short question answers about structure. But culture, you'll remember, isn't something that's usually written down. It's something that is observed, and just like bringing your theoretical lens, it's something that's often experienced. I think that this will be interesting, depending on who views this. That I'll share with you a story about culture that is very powerful to me, and that is really the way that social workers communicate with each other in various settings. So I came, as you know, from child protection, where there is a need to develop pretty highly refined skills in communicating with people messages that people don't always want to hear. So it's pretty important that you're able to communicate with families about the fact that someone has called you as an organisation and made a comment about their parenting that's unfavourable. And most of the time, in most of the places, people don't want you to visit. They don't welcome you. They didn't want you to come, and they're not going to be happy about what you've said. So from a strengths-based perspective, the good thing about that work, there are many good things. One of the good things is that speaking fairly directly is part of the organisational culture, calling a spade, to use an Australian expression, and really communicating clear messages with each other. Sometimes outsiders might suggest a little bit too harshly, that is those outside the organisation, but that was certainly a culture that I was very well accustomed to. Now, you'll know that I've come to a new organisation, and that's a social work department in a large university. And I came to that organisation now 4 years ago, and boy, what a shock I got when I first attended a staff meeting where people really didn't talk like that. They didn't speak directly to each other, and in fact, I'd have to say that it was almost as though I was visiting another country, and that I had to relearn the language. That such is the power of organisational culture. Sometimes I found it hard to understand whether people were actually in agreement or not in agreement. Organisational culture is a very, very powerful phenomenon, and I've probably now spoken for more than long enough about that because I diverted with a story. But you might have a think about what that means, and certainly as you go out on your placements. So this isn't so much for the test, but it is as you go out on your placements next year, that it's something that's really interesting to observe and perhaps have conversations with your supervisor about. I think that's probably a good segue though into the next topic, and that was in relation to leadership. We've talked a little bit, not a great deal, about leadership, and we've talked a little bit about leading change, and you've got some specific references for that, in particular in Hughes and Waring, I think have a good chapter. And part of both the models of leadership, transactional and transformational leadership we looked at, but also the content of leadership, how are decisions made was really something that we looked at, and to what extent are decisions made in collaboration across the workforce, in consultation with key stakeholders, or are they made with more of a hierarchical sense, that the person with authority makes decisions individually and without collaboration or consensus, is another really important indicator in relation to your analysis of the organisation. So that too relates very strongly to the topic of managerialism. We talked about managerialism as a phenomenon that has had a pervasive impact on human services organisations really since the 1980s, where what does managerialism mean? Where ideas about efficiency in business, in private business, were really introduced into welfare, into community sector organisations and to government welfare organisations. And you know, we talk quite a bit about ideas about efficiency that might include key performance indicators, timeliness, quality assurance, and measurements, targets. All of this kind of language is now part of the everyday parlance of many organisations, and that contracts that are awarded, and another key feature is the outsourcing of services to either private providers or non-government providers that were previously seen as core government business, run by government. The language in contracts will include much of this efficiency language. Well, that's all well and good, but so what for social workers? The important thing for us to think about is, how do you maintain your professionalism? How do you bring your expert knowledge to a managerialist context? Can you do that? Is it possible? And or are we just to be all overtaken with this sense of efficiency over effectiveness? And we've had some conversations about that, and I think that brings us toward the end of the series, but to the really interesting really bits about, with all of this knowledge and with this good understanding of context, as rich and as complex as it is, how are you able to operate as a professional in a human service organisation? And I think I'd invite you to reflect back on the podcast from some of our guests, and to really look at some of the tensions, the forces and tensions that they identified, and in particular the relevant chapters in Hughes and Waring and McDonald and Craik. So that's probably enough in relation to the tips for revision, and good luck in the tests.